When people outside Southeast Asia think about Vietnam, history usually begins with conflict. Wars, empires, colonization, and modern geopolitics dominate the narrative. Even when we move further back in time, Vietnamese history is often said to begin with early kingdoms such as Văn Lang or Âu Lạc, societies that resemble what we recognize today as organized states. But this way of telling history skips over something far older. Long before kingdoms, before borders, and before writing, there existed a deeper layer of memory among the people who lived in what is now northern Vietnam. That memory was not preserved in stone or metal. It was preserved in stories, rituals, and the way people understood themselves. That memory is known as Xích Quỷ. Xích Quỷ is not a kingdom you can locate on a modern map. It has no ruins to excavate, no palaces to reconstruct, no written laws to analyze, and yet its name has survived for thousands of years, repeated across generations. This alone forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Why would a society preserve the memory of something that never existed? The answer is that Xích Quỷ did exist, but not as a state, not as a government, and not as a political system. For most of human history, people did not record their past through writing. Instead, they explained who they were through stories, shaped by survival, environment, and shared experience. These stories were not entertainment, they were tools of memory. Xích Quỷ belongs to this ancient human tradition. Historians often describe it as proto-history, a bridge between lived reality and written history. The name Xích Quỷ appears in classical Vietnamese texts compiled many centuries later, including Linh Nam Chích Quai and Dai Viet Su Ki Tuan Thu. According to these sources, Xích Quỷ was associated with an ancestral ruler known as King Jung Vung, traditionally dated to around 2879 BCE. From a modern academic perspective, this date is symbolic. Archaeology does not show evidence of a centralized kingdom in northern Vietnam at that time, but this does not weaken the meaning of Xích Quỷ. In fact, it clarifies it. Xích Quỷ was never intended to describe a political state. It was a cultural explanation of origin. Even its name tells us this. In ancient East Asian cosmology, the color red symbolized the southern direction, warmth, sunlight, and life. It represented vitality rather than power. The word Quỷ, often misunderstood today as ghost, originally referred to ancestral spirits, the presence of the dead within the living community. When combined, Xích Quỷ can be understood as the southern land of ancestors. This framing changes everything. Xích Quỷ was not about territory, it was about identity. To understand why such an idea emerged, we need to look at the land itself. Northern Vietnam lies within the Red River Basin, one of the most environmentally unstable regions in Southeast Asia. Seasonal monsoon rains bring both abundance and destruction. Floodwaters fertilize the land, but they can also erase entire settlements in a single season. Dense forests, wetlands, and shifting coastlines made life unpredictable. For early human communities, survival here was never guaranteed. In this environment, cooperation was not optional. Wet rice agriculture, which eventually became the foundation of Vietnamese life, required synchronized labor. Fields had to be prepared together, water had to be shared and controlled, and planting had to follow seasonal cycles. No individual could survive alone. Villages endured only if people worked as a unit. Over generations, this worldview shaped a worldview in which community mattered more than individual authority. Unity was not a moral ideal or political choice, it was a survival strategy. This worldview is reflected clearly in the ancestral figures associated with Xích Quỷ. In myth, King Jung Vung is presented as a ruler, but modern scholars do not interpret him as a historical king. Instead, he represents a symbolic ancestor, the idea of convergence, the moment when scattered groups began to see themselves as part of a shared cultural whole. His legendary union with a dragon maiden is often misunderstood as fantasy. In anthropological terms, it represents something very real: the integration of inland agricultural communities with river and coastal populations. Land and water, mountain and delta became part of a single cultural system. This symbolic lineage continues with the figure of Loch Long Quon, whose identity is inseparable from water. In Vietnamese mythology, he is associated with rivers, floods, and dragons. This is not accidental. Water was the greatest source of both life and danger for early communities in the Red River Basin. Leadership in this context was not defined by conquest or domination. It was defined by the ability to manage nature, to control water, reduce destruction, and protect the community. One of the most well-known Vietnamese origin stories describes 100 eggs giving birth to many children. To modern audiences, this may sound like pure myth, but it was never meant to be taken literally. It is a metaphor, and a powerful one. The story explains how many different groups living in different regions could share a single cultural origin. It acknowledges diversity while emphasizing unity. From this idea comes the Vietnamese concept of Dong Bao, meaning people born from the same womb. This concept remains central to Vietnamese identity even today. From an archaeological perspective, Xích Quỷ cannot be identified as a historical state. No site can be excavated and labeled as its capital. Yet prehistoric cultures such as Phung Nguyen, Dong Dao, and Go Mun show continuous human occupation, technological development, and social organization in northern Vietnam thousands of years before written history. These societies had the tools, the knowledge, and the communal structures necessary to form shared memories of origin. Xích Quỷ, then, should not be dismissed as a meaningless legend. It is a cultural memory shaped by environment, survival, and collective experience. It does not tell us when Vietnam began as a nation. It tells us something deeper. It tells us how Vietnamese identity formed before dynasties were named, before borders were drawn, and before history was written. Long before there was a state, there was a community. Long before there was a nation, there was shared ancestry. Long before history, there was memory. That memory is Xích Quỷ, and that is why it still matters.